We're going to continue our first lesson about westward migration in the United States after the years of the Civil War and Reconstruction. We first addressed the issues of Native Americans and the fact that many of them were displaced and put on new lands and reservations. Many treaties were made but later to be broken by the U.S. government, and also many wars broke out between white settlers and soldiers and the Native American tribes themselves. We mentioned some specific battles like Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Wounded Knee, and that was just a few of the many violent confrontations that broke out between these two groups. After the last major Indian War in 1890, which was the Battle of Wounded Knee, many more people began moving out west to settle. However, this settlement of the West began long before the Civil War even started. We had mentioned before in some of the videos that we watched from the America Story of Us series that many groups of people had made their way by wagon trails out west, such as the Donner Party, who met a very unfortunate end in their route, but many people did make it. They were mostly groups that were from different ethnicities: Germans, Swedes, Irish, whatever you can name. Groups represented that ethnic group or religious group, such as the Mormons, in going out west. They went for basically the same reason, to start a new life. Many were hoping to strike it rich, in such as the gold rush of 1849, where California was rumored to have large portions of gold. It took approximately 6 months before the railroad tracks were finally completed. It took about 6 months for wagons to make it from the East Coast to the West Coast. A lot of times these journeys were divided into different segments so that it could be more manageable. So they would make camps at different locations for several weeks or even months at a time in that 6-month journey, just in order to survive certain seasons. Women, men, and children all had different tasks along the trails, but a negative result of many people moving out west was the fact that they damaged the environment. You're going to see the impact of this when we talk about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which occurred during the years of the Great Depression. Many of these settlers constantly tore up the topsoil in planting crops as they made camps for certain periods of time. Also, you'll see the farmers that made permanent settlements in places like Kansas and Oklahoma also did this. So years later, in the 1930s, when bad weather conditions hit, that topsoil was already loosened from years of settlement and therefore contributed to the dust storms that broke out, which was nicknamed the Dust Bowl. However, once the trains were established from East Coast to West Coast, people were able to get out west much quicker and easier. It took about 6 days as opposed to 6 months. So therefore, many more settlers came out after the construction of the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. The government wanted to encourage more people to move out west to improve the conditions and therefore contribute to the economy's growth. You can see these different laws that were made by Congress in the years of the 1860s and even going up to 1902, where the government would give certain types of incentives for people to go out west to live on the land. If you look on page 215 of your book, the Homestead Act is mentioned there, and basically this was 160 acres of land for free. All these people had to do was to promise to live on it for a period of 5 years and improve it. Other than that, they could have the 160 acres of land, which is a huge amount of land. It's about twice the size of property that this school sits on. You can see other acts that were passed by Congress which are not mentioned in your book, but you could Google these and find out exactly what was promised by the government in order to lure more people out to the west so that the economy could be improved. As more people moved out west, they started making territorial governments. You had to be a territory first before you became a state. There were some guidelines that were set up from way back after we won our independence from the British that kind of guided territories in their process to become states. There had to be a certain amount of settlers in the territory before they could apply for statehood. They had to submit a proposed state constitution, but they were under the control of the Congress and the president until they became a final state, and obviously after they became a state as well. The territories depended on the federal government in order to exist, period. The federal government's promise of land and money to people with these laws here encouraged people to come more and more into the territories and therefore increase the amount of settlers, which would then allow them to become states. The first main group of people that came to the West were miners. Going back to that idea of the gold rush of 1849, many more people hoped to strike it rich in places in the West, such as California, in order to become millionaires overnight. The process that this took was waves of newcomers coming across the Mississippi into the western states. And as more and more people came out, and some did strike it rich, some did not, there were boom and bust cycles in the economy. There were periods of time where it seemed like people were gaining a lot of profit off of things that were found, such as gold and silver and other types of minerals, like iron ore. But there were other cycles where it didn't seem that people were finding much of anything, and therefore the economy was not improved. In fact, it was worsened. The idea of instant cities or boom towns was created because of these people moving out west to mine. Some examples of these kinds of cities would be San Francisco, California, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Denver, Colorado. These initially started as boom towns when miners tried to strike it rich out in those locations. There were several different kinds of mining that these people used to try to find the riches underneath the surface of the earth. Placer mining was more of a surface technique where they would use simple tools like pickaxes and shovels to try to locate items underground. Obviously, there's a limit to how much you could find using those kinds of tools. So the other type of mining would be quartz mining, where they would mine deep into the earth and therefore set up permanent structures where they could go deep into under the surface of the earth, and even put in place railroad cars to try to bring the materials found to the surface. Many of these mines still exist today across the country. They're dangerous to work in, but you can definitely make it rich if you find what you're looking for. You can see some examples where the strikes that were made into the earth did produce a huge amount of profit. You can see this one right here, the Comstock lode, which was made in Colorado and Nevada. It produced over $306 million worth of gold and silver. So these people definitely made it rich. Other important strikes were made in these western states, which contributed even more to new camps and boom towns being set up, just like I mentioned with these cities right here. There was also some legends that came about from this time period as miners were looking to go out west. Calamity Jane, if you've ever heard of her before, was a famous icon of this time. Towards the end of the 1870s was the final movements made to try to mine in the West. After that point, they pretty much had found what they could find under the earth, and the mining bonanza kind of came to an end. The word bonanza itself just means like a frenzy, and the miners had a bonanza, the ranchers had a bonanza, the farmers had a bonanza, and these were just periods of time where it seemed like everybody wanted to participate in that activity. A negative consequence of the mining bonanza was that much more racism was brought about towards people that tried to engage in mining. Many groups of people came into these boom towns, these mining towns, from different countries. You can see the Chinese were coming over, obviously since they are on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, coming into California would be the first logical place that they would stop. People from Chile, Peru, Mexico, France, Germany, all these people were competing for the same wealth, which would lead to hostility and riots, and even government intervention. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 forbid further immigration of Chinese people into our country, which is ironic because not only were these people coming over for mining, but many Chinese were brought over to build the transcontinental railroads, and we used their labor for that, but once those were completed, then we no longer saw a reason for them to be here. The good thing about the mining bonanza is that overall it did contribute billions of dollars to the economy. It did help to pay off a lot of the debt from the Civil War, and it provided a lot of the capital or necessary finances for the Industrial Revolution, which was to come very soon. Now let's discuss the life of cattle ranchers, which was another major group of people like the miners who moved out west in these years of the mid to late 1800s. If you look on page 208 of your book, you can see where these notes on this screen come from. Cattle ranching became a very profitable business both during and after the Civil War. A lot of that was because the Native Americans had been moved out of the way, so you could then engage in cattle ranching without the fear of native attacks. Also, many of the techniques that were used for cattle ranching came from our previous interaction with the Spanish, both down in Mexico with the Mexican-American War, but also the original Spanish conquistadors that came over and the ones that stayed in the New World. Some of their techniques were used by American cattle ranchers. Because of the Civil War, there was a big demand for beef to feed the soldiers, which made cattle ranching very profitable. As ranchers moved out west, they established, similar to the boom towns of the miners, what was called the cow towns. And these were places where the cattle trails ended and the railroads were beginning to cross through. The railroad cars would then be filled with cattle to be shipped back east. The life of a cowboy was not one that was easy by any stretch of the imagination. They worked very long hours. They had to be expert in different techniques. They had to be able to use guns successfully on horseback to protect their herds from outlaws and other types of criminals. They had to be able to herd cattle from an open range into these trails and moved almost 1,000 miles at times to get to the cow town, which is what the long drive was. Many obstacles were faced during these long drives, such as storms and stampedes of cattle, and therefore these were always threats to the lives and well-beings of the cowboys. So even though the life of cowboys is made legend in movies and TV shows, it wasn't the easiest life at all. The open range was the area of land out west which basically was up for grabs. Anybody could herd their cattle onto it and let their cattle graze onto the land, but there were several things that made that whole idea end. Number one, too many people were doing the same thing. Kind of like what I mentioned with the miners. As more people moved out west with wagon trails, they continually dug up the topsoil. Same thing with the cattle ranchers. As their animals grazed onto the land, it became depleted of nutrients. And with series of bad weather from different winters and storms in the summers, it made the idea of having your cattle out on the open range something dangerous. But probably the biggest thing that ended the idea of an open range where anybody could have their herds was the invention of something simple called barbed wire. It was invented by a guy named Joseph Glidden, and basically it allowed ranchers to section off pieces of their land from other ranchers so that you couldn't just put your cattle wherever you wanted to. It was now restricted. So the idea of the open range was then gone. The cattle bonanza, like we mentioned, first started on the open range, and they did use techniques from their Spanish counterparts. They did allow the cattle to be shipped east with the railroads, which helped to feed the nation out east, especially at the end of the Civil War. The cow towns were where the railroads crossed through. Some of these trails to get to the cow towns became legendary as well. The Chisholm Trail is one that we're going to watch a short video on, and you can see basically that it was about 1,000 miles in distance that you had to move the cattle the entire time to get to this cow town so that you could ship your cattle back east and therefore make a profit. But by 1880, a lot of cattle had been driven to these railroad towns, these cow towns, and shipped east, and therefore were able to feed a lot of people and make these ranchers very wealthy in some cases. Plus, with some of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there was more technology in being able to slaughter the cattle and refrigerate the meat and be able to keep it longer. The idea of refrigerated railroad cars came into play. Cold storage in some of the factories in the east further developed the idea of cattle grazing. Finally, the last thing I want to look at real quick is the Farming Bonanza itself. And if you look on pages, let's see here real quick. Page 215 again, you can see some of these groups of people, and then when you flip over to 216 and 217, some of the new inventions that made farmers' lives easier. Once the cattle ranchers saw their lifestyle hindered with the idea of barbed wire, more and more people came out as farmers instead, and they were able to cultivate the land, but like I said before, some of that was bad because it did loosen up the topsoil. Some of these people coming out were freedmen after Reconstruction to escape some of the conditions in the South with the KKK and Jim Crow laws, and they were known as exodusters. Most of them came out to places like Kansas, and they were there trying to find a better life as a farmer as opposed to living in the South. To live out in the middle parts of our country, the Great Plains, was not an easy thing. If you look at the picture at the bottom of 216, these were the kinds of structures that they had to build to live on, called soddies. But fortunately, there were many inventions made in farming technology that made their work a little bit easier. You can see some of them mentioned here, which is also on your book in pages 217. And you can see what each of these things did and how they helped their lives to get a little bit easier. The idea of Bonanza Farms, where farmers would grow huge amounts of land in one single crop, became a popular idea, but it was also risky. If you just focused on one crop, such as wheat, if there was a bad season for it or bad weather and you didn't have other crops to rely on, it could make you lose all of your money. But if you were able to make money off of it, you could make huge profits as well. So there were definitely some challenges for farmers in these years after the Civil War. But a lot of it was due to these new technologies, which was a part of the Industrial Revolution as well.